Welcome everybody. What an incredible film we just saw together. And we're so lucky tonight to be joined with a number of amazing Indigenous leaders who are with us tonight. My name is Zipporah Berman. I'm the International Program Director at Stand.Earth. I also chair the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations. If you don't know whose territory you are in, I'm going to ask my colleagues to type into the chat nativelands.ca. There you can find out whose unceded territory you are in to acknowledge and recognize that. So, an incredible group of people here with us today. If you've just joined us, just so you know, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, as well as an interpretation button. We hope you will ask questions. I'll be moderating them and try and bring as many of your voices into the discussion as possible. And the interpretation button, you can click there and choose your language, English or Spanish, to be able to make sure that you can follow our speakers simultaneously. Ooh, I'm gonna do that too. Okay, let me introduce you to the incredible people that we have with us today. Just going to check. I see Lizardo, Melina, Cannahouse, and Andre. I don't see Casey. Ah, and there's Lizardo with his video on. Awesome. Okay, well, I mean, given the film, probably Melina needs no introduction. But I would like to say that I'm honored to be here with Melina Lubicon Massimo, a dear friend, and an inspiration to me now for, how long have we known each other, Melina? Over a decade. Melina, of course, is the film's protagonist. She's Lubicon Cree from Northern Alberta. She's the founder of Sacred Earth Solar and the campaign director at Indigenous Climate Action. Melina was born in Northern Alberta in a small town named Peace River and was raised in a town 65 miles to the east of Peace River called Little Buffalo. Melina is Lubicon Cree and one of Canada's First Nations tribes. Melina was raised with traditional tribal customs, living off the land, hunting and using local plants as medicine, exploring local forests and swamps. I know from experience working with Melina for over a decade that she is a force to be reckoned with. I'm really excited to have you here today, Melina. We're also joined today by Lizardo Cooper. Lizardo is a Shipibo leader, president of the Interethnic Association for Development of the Peruvian Forest, IDESEP, Peru's national organization that brings together more than 1,809 indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon. Lizardo, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Next, we have Cannahouse Manuel. I'm sure many of you know Cannahouse from her incredible work in her community. Cannahouse is co-founder with other Secwépemc female land defenders of the Tiny House Warrior Movement, a mother, water, and land defender, and a member of the Secwépemc Women's Warrior Society. Cannahouse's family has led the struggle for rights and sovereignty in the territory of the Secwépemc people for generations. Her late father, Arthur Manuel, a former chief and residential school survivor, was a global champion for Indigenous rights and title in Canada and abroad. He's author of the Reconciliation Manifesto and Unsettling Canada. Her late grandfather, George Manuel, was the second president of the National Indian Brotherhood, now the Assembly of First Nations. Cannahouse has been a real inspiration to me on the journey around the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We've been now fighting that project for, is it 8 years now, 9 years? And her persistence and dedication and creativity is really unmatched. So excited to have you here. Next, we have Andres Tapia. Andreas is the elected leader and communications director of the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of the Ecuadorian Amazon, Confanaye. This is the umbrella organization that groups 11 Amazonic nations. Andreas is a member of the San Jacinto del Pindio commune of the Quechua nationality of Picaru. He is a biologist and community communicator, audiovisual producer participating in various productions and co-productions on realities and visions of social organizations and Indigenous peoples. He's the author of several books, publications, and articles on social and environmental issues. Andreas, welcome. So we're going to start taking questions really soon. And so I hope you will join us by putting your questions in the Q&A function. If you're joining us tonight on Facebook Live, please also send us your questions. We have folks that will transfer them into this platform so I can see them. Some of you are already putting questions in the chat. If you could put questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, that would be super helpful. If you've just joined us, again, if you'd like interpretation, please go to the bottom of your screen, press the globe button. You can choose English or Spanish. So before we start taking questions from the, well over 100 people who have joined us this evening after watching the film, I'd like to turn to each of you to ask you if you can just tell us a little bit about what's happening right now in your territory, about the work that you're currently doing, and how can people get involved and support the work that you're doing. Let's start with the woman. How about that? Canna House, can you tell us what's going on up there with the Tiny House Warriors right now, what you're experiencing, and how people can get involved and support what you're doing?
Yes, right now I'm here located in Secwepemc territory in Blue River, and this is actually right inside one of the tiny houses that we have positioned on so-called Crown land, which is unceded, unsurrendered Secwepemc territory. And we're actually millimeters outside of an injunction zone that has been placed by Trans Mountain Pipeline to build a man camp. Recently, we heard news from a local news report that the Blue River camp has been canceled. We have not heard word from Trans Mountain themselves whether this information is correct or not. We've been here occupied since July 2018, and it's the site, again, like I said, 1,000 men. We're stopping this man camp, but the increase of pipeline workers are coming from Alberta and different areas into this Highway 5 corridor, which is the Trans Mountain Pipeline corridor, is increasing. So we're seeing all the local motels along the way filled with industry workers. So although we've fought this man camp, they're continuing to bring in pipeline workers and housing them in the local motels and other accommodations. So we fear for the safety of all our women and Two-Spirit and trans that are traveling on this route right now. And we're saying for all the women to be safe and careful, because of when the increase of oil workers come into our communities, we'll see increased violence against our women. And there's much research about this. The construction is ramping up all along this pipeline corridor, 1,000 kilometers plus. And the threat is very real because the Yellowhead area in the northern part of this pipeline corridor is
Oh, Canna House, we can't hear you right now. And so it may be the Wi-Fi. Going to ask you if you can try turning off your
land defenders.
Okay. We can hear you again.
Okay. Yeah, I'm calling in from the mountains here, and the reception or the cell signal reception isn't always that great, but thank you. I'm happy to be on this panel. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you. Nice to see you, Melina.
It's great to have you here. And I know we're going to get a lot of questions about Trans Mountain, although I have a lot of our audience, of course, is from British Columbia and has been learning a lot about this project. Many of the names that I'm seeing float by have been involved in the campaign. So we'll be coming back to you shortly. I want to go now south. Lizardo, I know that it's been a very difficult time in Peru. Of course, it's a difficult time everywhere with the pandemic. But specifically in Peru, there's been a lot of upheaval. I understand recently a there has also been the introduction of interpretations of the rights of Indigenous peoples that were not very good. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what's going on in your territory, and how has the pandemic exacerbated the problems in the Amazon?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And good evening to everyone, everyone watching and listening. It's a reality that in the Peruvian Amazon, there's more than 2,000 communities. And the sad reality that we're living here in the Peruvian Amazon, because these communities are very vulnerable. We don't have public health basic services or intercultural health services. But we keep persisting and resisting. During the pandemic as well, the extractive industry has not been stopped. It has kept going on. And that's been despite the increased risk of this pandemic. And you have to understand that currently the Amazon continues to be threatened by mining and extractive industries, gas, oil, and illicit cultivation of coca. And so it's not just the pandemic that is affecting and taking our lives. It's also those that are threatening and murdering us beyond this pandemic. The economic, we could say the illegal economic activities of the Peruvian government. And we've been trying to figure out how to stop these territorial invasions. And so currently, the leaders are being threatened by those that traffic through and invade in our lands. However, indigenous peoples are continuing to fight for our lives, for our territories, for our voice, and for our biodiversity, because we are part of that biodiversity. However, our fight is not just for us. It's for a global vision of communities. And it's a huge challenge for us and for humanity. It's a huge challenge because we are not just fighting to conserve and protect our sacred places and our correlations with the earth and our cultural values, economic values, and spiritual values. But that's what our human rights mean to us, whereas the government only sees economic value. But we're fighting for all humanity occupying this earth. But currently, we need solidarity from the international community to support those that are living daily and suffering and are experiencing the effects of climate change, but also the daily threats of these industries. They murdered 4 important leaders during the pandemic, and there's not been justice. These threats continue to exist for us. So currently, we need the international community to know the reality that we're living. We contribute, and we're going to continue contributing to humanity. That's the idea. Also, We need to sue the Peruvian government or demand that they give us health care. We must demand that they respect our human rights, and they can't be making unilateral decisions. They need to respect the consent, the collective rights of the indigenous peoples before thinking about reactivating the economy of the country. We need to be thinking about the human rights. And the next generation that's coming, our children, our grandchildren, they need to be able to be happy and prosper. We want to reaffirm our commitment to keep fighting for our lives, for our health, and for our ancestral territories.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lizardo. I just am humbled by everything that you are experiencing, and also your incredible persistence. I've learned so much from many in your community since I started working on the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative. For those who don't know, there is an initiative that Pachamama Alliance and Amazon Watch and Stand.Earth have been working with Indigenous leadership, Confanee and Idasat, Orpio and Koika in partnership in Peru and Ecuador to lift up the vision of the living forest that the Indigenous leaders have, and to stop all extraction in the sacred headwaters of the Amazon in Peru and Ecuador. I'm going to ask Alicia if you could put that information in the chat. I see, oh, you have, to panelists and attendees. So if you'd like to join the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, there is some information in the chat. While we're talking about the Amazon, allow me to turn to you, Andreas, and get your voice in here. I know that in your communities, you've been experiencing not only the pandemic, but also the flooding and oil spills, and then you know, and more recently, I saw you're taking quite a strong stance relative to the definition of FPIC. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what's going on in the communities in Ecuador right now?
Muchas gracias. Pues sí.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, in the Ecuadorian Amazon, we're living a triple pandemic. Like we've said, it hasn't just been COVID-19, but simultaneous. Since the pandemic has started in March, floodings that have also impacted a lot of the communities and the community infrastructure, but also the extractive industries in all parts, especially in mining, the exploitation of the mining, and also in oiling. And so we can see that this has been the pandemic that has affected us throughout COVID-19. And in fact, it has been the source of also contagion, because it's been a virus that wasn't present here but came from outside, and because of the extractive industries that came into indigenous communities who brought the virus. Like in the national park Yosemite, people were contracted COVID from outside, people outside of the community. Inside of the oil block. And so that's how the population, Guaram, was infected, and that's how all the community became more vulnerable and infected. And especially in the southern part and on the coast of Ecuador, they also were carriers of the virus that also spread through the communities and also spread throughout the community, all the indigenous communities of Amazonia and Ecuador. And the employees of those companies are the ones that brought the sickness to the communities. And for example, in mining, where the workers or different employees from the mining companies would travel outside of the country and then return to Ecuador a few days before the pandemic started, came back to Ecuador and tested positive. And so we're seeing a situation of triple vulnerability in the communities of Amazonia and in general indigenous communities. And so it's a public health issue, and the vulnerabilities were extremely strong. But before all of these problems, the organizations and communities had an immediate response and an autonomous and self-sustained response, critical in response to these companies and in response to this pandemic. And this is the reality that we have been confronting. It's been a huge challenge. And we've also been able to overcome, at least in this first phase, which has been a really critical time. And we're also still very alert about what could still come.
Of course. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in. Please keep them coming. We are moderating those questions. If any of our panelists wants to answer live, you can click on Q&A. You can type answers to anything that you want if you want to, and don't feel like you have to though. Melina, I know that you worked for so many years on oil extraction in the tar sands and many other places. And then more recently, in the last couple of years, you've moved to doing incredible work, bringing us the stories of Indigenous leadership around solutions. I've been making my way through all of the Power to People episodes. I love them. Thank you for taking us all into all of those communities. I'd love to hear what you're working on right now with ICA. How can people help? And anything you want to share to us about what you learned from those couple of years of visiting so many Indigenous communities.
I hope you can hear me okay. Okay. I just wanted to acknowledge our ancestors and the people that have come before us in these struggles and this fight, and also our brothers down south that I'm really hearing you, and my heart is heavy, and sitting with you in prayer and thought and thinking of you. I've been down south in some of your territories, and I've seen the devastation, like the devastation has been wreaked upon our homelands up here where I'm from in the tar sands, which is one of the biggest industrial projects on the planet. And I think of you, and I send love, because I know that's not an easy thing of what you're going through down south, and how the murder and violation of the communities is nonstop and persistent. And it's something that we experience up here, but not to the extent that I've seen of just the brutality. And I just want to acknowledge that for my brothers that are on this panel. And I will keep praying and standing in solidarity with you for the rest of my days while I'm on this earth. I come from a small community, as you saw, in the Condor and Eagle, which has been ravaged by oil and gas fracking, logging since before I was born. And so was born into this at the age of 7, already on a pipeline and oil logging blockade with my family and elders of the community. So it's something I've inherited and something that I can't really walk away from. And as I know with all the other people on the panel. And so for me, after experiencing many years of just the constant onslaught and violation of our peoples and constantly just trying to work nonstop to stop the destruction, I realized after a massive oil spill back home that if I don't start building something that we can transition and in utilizing just transition technologies for now, I know they're not the end all be all, but when we can use transition technologies, if our communities can access those transition technologies, that is something that I wanted to be a part of, because it felt like no matter how much I went around the world to speak about the destruction and devastation my family day in, day out still was experiencing the impacts of not being able to breathe clean air, drink clean water, encroachment and devastation of our homelands and contamination, massive contamination. So a part of putting up just transition technologies or climate solutions is to try to help us transition away from destruction of our homelands. And it's a challenging thing to feel like a lot of times there's not solutions, but there are some solutions that are slowly out there. It's a slow go with our nations across coast to coast up here. The point of the people, the TV show that we filmed, was to try to start profiling and showing other communities what's possible currently now, instead of constantly having to import diesel and propane and all the different types of fossil fuels that make such an impact on all of our collective homelands. Can we utilize transition technologies now to help us get off of renewable, or to get off of fossil fuels into renewable energy? And eco-housing, food security as well, of how do we become, what now non-Indigenous folks call net zero. Our communities have always been net zero. We have always lived off the land in reciprocity and connection with Mother Earth. So how do we transition back to the forced imposition that has been imposed on our communities to become immensely dependent on outside fuel, food, all of the oppressive governmental policies that were literally imposed on our people. When people didn't obey those, they were, delivered a death sentence. So I think it's hard to go from one crisis to another, and that's what we're currently doing. And that was the point of shooting Power to the People, to showcase what Indigenous communities are doing, that they're leaders and that there's champions within each community that can do these things and transition. And, that's what I hear on this panel today. All of us have a part to play, whether we're fighting or we're building or we're doing it at the same time. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the past while, of trying to fight, but also trying to build and transition. And that was the point of building solar installations in our communities in the heart of the tar sands, and also standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Secwepemc territory with building solar into the tiny house warriors, as well as now with Gidendam and Wet'suwet'en. So that's kind of what I'm working on, is solarizing Indigenous communities, and also bringing about like just transition and also healing justice to our communities, because the stuff that we work on is very traumatizing, and we also are allowed place and times to heal from the trauma that is, historically been wreaked on our communities. And so that's another thing I'm working on right now. So hi, it's nice to be part of this discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melina. And as usual, you made it real with your incredible grace. There's something almost impossible about hearing what's going on and then figuring out how you continue in a panel like this. My heart was hurting so much listening to everything that's going on. And I realized it's in part why the film is so inspiring and why all of your work is so inspiring, because you go on, not for a year or 2 years, but for hundreds of years. I think it was in the Quechua territory when I was there, that one of the elders said, but that's how we learn to walk. You put one foot in front of the other, you just keep going. And I think that's in part what we're doing. We have a lot of questions about youth coming in, and about youth involvement, what to say to youth at this moment in time. How can they best be most effective? What should they do? I think in particular, what are the best ways, do you think, to educate and mobilize youth? And many thanks in the thread for the fabulous film. I'm wondering if any of you would like to speak directly to youth and to youth organizing. Just wave at me. Great, Cannahouse, please.
Yes, I love our Indigenous youth that have really taken a strong stance and taking action on their own initiatives to fight back against this system that has oppressed us for so long. The youth are constantly teaching us the creative ways to resist, and they use technology and social media to get their message out and to mobilize more youth to be involved and to educate. And that's how we learn from them as well. So it's not that we're teaching young people, we learn together, and young people have a role just equally as all of us do in our nations. And one of the things that I always encourage youth, even though people use getting arrested to get their message out, I know that criminalization of our Indigenous youth is at a high point, and not just land offenders, but Indigenous people were over policed and were over prosecuted, and land offenders especially are being criminalized for their stance in defending land and forced to the court system. Tiny House Warriors, we just had a lawyer quit on us at a trial that we were supposed to be having last week and then again this week. And so this is some of the issues that we see, but I really believe that the actions that took place to shut down Canada in support of the Wet'suwet'en and the police raids that happened in the Wet'suwet'en territory with our relatives fighting the Coastal GasLink pipeline is that we saw Indigenous people, our allies and supporters across Canada, shut down major cities and transportation corridors in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, and we're going to see that again. There's a national call of action from all the front lines across Canada from November 23rd and to the 29th, asking allies and supporters to stand with us as we assert our sovereignty to our lands to fight these big projects. And the young people are a big part of these national-wide networks of organizing. So we're going to see more of it because these young people are the majority in Indigenous country in Canada. They are the majority, and the 15, 16, 17-year-olds and even into the early 20s are Indigenous youth. We have a whole camp full of them here. And it's the organizing that took place at the BC legislature, occupation and support of the Wet'suwet'en that have spun off to really put their efforts behind all the front lines. And so I just want to even give a special thanks to all the Indigenous youth organizers out there. They're amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Really amazing. Giving us hope. You know, one of the things I've noticed in having the opportunity to work with all of you or with some of you in your communities. I don't think, Andreas, we've been able to spend time together, but I have spent some time in your communities. And the thing that has struck me so profoundly is how differently, but in so many places of the world, Indigenous peoples view the concept of wealth. And I've had these conversations now with some of the elders in Ecuador about how important it is right now at this moment in history for people around the world to be viewing wealth in a different way. I'll never forget one night in the Quechua village, and I was sitting with an elder, and he said to me, so I've been studying your society, and I understand that your concept of wealth surrounds this paper money that you've created. And it was just the simplest of concepts that kind of turned for me my world on its head, you know. And then so I just, and he said, I don't understand it, that all of it surrounds this paper money you've created. Can you explain it to me? And I couldn't explain it to him. And so I just asked him, how do you define wealth? And he said, well, it's simple. It's love and community and a living forest. And this idea that we would define whether we're wealthy by a sense of community and love and the living systems that we're in seems to me so simple yet so profound, and something that I've seen in so many Indigenous communities I've had the opportunity to work with across Canada as well. And it seems like almost like a thread that is binding the vision and the resistance together around the world. Andreas, I'm sure I have not done that justice, but I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about this concept of wealth and how important the concept of a living forest is, what we can learn from it.
Sí, sin duda creo que lo has explicado.
Yeah, I think you explained it really well. Because there wouldn't be, a definition to understand wealth in these capitalist parameters, right? But how we define wealth is going to have obviously other parameters that are not going to coincide with the globalized world. We're always going to say that for us, is that we want to aspire to live in harmony with community, with nature, in harmony with all the families that are part of the community. And that really connects us very much with nature, with the environment. And so that's how we start understanding and connecting to these sort of primordial principles, to live and to feel that we're living well, and that we are able to understand that as wealth. But for example, this material part of it, the relationship that we have with nature, it also has a spiritual part. Something that we're seeing with the pandemic as well, the plants and their connection with chakras, and the women and how they connect with plants, how we can connect with our ancestors, our grandparents, and the transmission of this knowledge through generations, and how we integrate this knowledge into the community and these connections. And so that converts itself into the standards that we apply to our lives and our understanding of wealth, transmission of wisdom, the legacy. That is wealth as well. A lot of it has to do with energies and spirits that affirm us in our journeys, in our thoughts, and in our goals. But it's also material because they're very concrete things. They're things that we live every day and that allow us to keep moving forward and see in our real lives the struggle and the reasons why we defend the Amazon. It's not just like a speech or like even an individual appreciation, but it's part of a collective vision of our communities. And they are what lead us to want to defend our Amazon, right? So that's how we explain wealth, the necessity, and that's what informs our necessity to defend our lands and continue transmitting to current and future generations. And you had asked about the youth as well. So that's part of, that conversation too. The importance of transmitting this to them so that they can feel like an active part of the development and transformation of their environment and their society. If it's in the Amazon or other parts of the world, I think the young people are always going to be really receptive to this knowledge. It's really important to connect them to this fight to defend our planet.
Thank you so much. Luzardo, I know that for now over a year, there have been many conversations and research and meetings about the vision of the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, and a plan that will be put forward in the coming months to all of the governments. Can you tell us a little bit about the Indigenous leaders' vision for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters?
Ok, muchas gracias. Sí,
Yes,
tenemos...
okay. Thank you very much. We have a plan. We have an action plan from the indigenous perspective and cosmovision. The current development system is an imposition that imposes and doesn't pay attention to the reality of the indigenous community. So an alternative that we propose for the indigenous community has a cultural focus and a focus on human rights. And we have proposed a plan, an action plan, a plan of actions that respect human rights, that respect environmental justice, that respects the basic principles of the indigenous communities. And so that's the plan we have to articulate, knowing that there are very well that there's two economic currents, one that imposes from the economy to the communities, and one that responds from the communities. That is not a development plan, but we, yes, do propose a development plan because we believe, or we think, we don't only think, we live those realities. And those realities have to be part of the politics that the government recognizes the indigenous communities who are also citizens of Peru, that also have rights, basic rights, and the right to administer their own resources on their lands and their own sovereignty, and not to have it imposed and unilaterally decided. So when we talk about that they respect the rights of indigenous communities, they kill us, they criminalize us. That is not development. That is to economize and profit off of us. And that makes big corporations in other countries rich. That's not development for us. So the international banks, they all finance folks to go into Amazonia at the cost of our lives as human beings. That is not development for us. We demand justice. If it's going to be development, it has to be equitable, clearly, because it's not good that the big corporations, the big stakeholders who also have kids just like me, have big companies. We have to understand and be clear. We're proposing a complete change, a total change. We want a real development that doesn't just extract resources and divides folks in the country, and not just to Peru or in Peru, but to the whole world. Because thank you to our defense of our fresh water, we would be living consequences, really big consequences. And in this pandemic, the global powers have not given a response to this, but the indigenous communities have through our ancestral clinics, which are called our forests. But if it hadn't been like that, all of the indigenous communities would be dead, because we have combated this pandemic with our plants and our ancestral knowledge. And this is what the world has to recognize. This is what the states and the governments have to recognize, that yes, the indigenous communities and knowledges and ancestral knowledges exist. And that's the kind of plan that we have proposed to our Peruvian government, who has to recognize and receive and discuss and socialize, and also put forth public policies that to indigenous communities and the thousands of people in Amazonia and in other places. Thank you.
Fantastic. We have a lot of questions about how people can support you and the fight in the Amazon, both to Lizardo and Andreas. But before you answer, I will note, we've also have questions about where the oil is going. We've started a project as part of the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, where the Stand Research Group is tracking the oil that is currently and proposed to be extracted in Ecuador and Peru. And we're tracking it right to the end users, and we'll be releasing all of that information. We found that a lot of the oil from Ecuador, the far majority, is going to California. And we're able now to track to the refineries and right to the end companies. We've also been tracking the finances, and we have found that there are 5 European banks who claim to support human rights, indigenous rights, UNDRIP. They claim to support protection of biodiversity and stopping climate change, and they're all trading in this oil. And so jointly with indigenous leadership, we've called on those banks to stop trading in oil from the Amazon. If you go to Stand.Earth, you can send letters to those companies, and please join up on our list, because this matters. They don't like to be exposed for having taken part in this disastrous development, especially at this moment in history. These are not only critical human rights issues, they're human rights issues all over the planet, because the Amazon plays such a huge role in maintaining the Earth's climate stability. Andreas, Lizardo, I don't know if either of you have anything to add about what you would like to see people do in order to support your work. Please.
Muchas gracias. Yo puedo empezar.
Thank you very much. I can start. I would like to invite all the European banks to come live in the Amazon and to live the reality of, and to see that 3 people in the indigenous communities were assassinated just for asking for basic services. That Canadian company, that kind of company that violates rights, but not just violates rights, but also assassinates and murders people in the Amazon who are fighting for our lives. And these economies are not development. Why do you think we've come and mobilized in a peaceful way to demand that we need hospitals, medicine, all of this in the middle of a pandemic? The answer was to defend those corrupt managers. And that's all a lie. We're not assassins. We're not looking for conflict. We are looking for peace, tranquility, harmony. and also that we demand that our rights be respected. But for the government to send police, armed police, and to discriminate us, what does the government, the Peruvian government say? Or the Canadian government? They're going to send those kind of companies to the Amazon that are going to violate our rights and assassinate people. That is not justice. Only one group of elites colluding with companies and corrupt politicians. We demand real justice. And we don't want just business folks and corporations that are just coming to get their pockets full of wealth. And we have people who have been left without parents. Is that what those companies are going to come take care of in terms of education or anything? No. That's why we say, in terms of extraction, that is not development for the indigenous communities. We just abuse, trash everything in our communities. So we're not saying we're against the development of our country. What we're saying is this system that they're proposing of development doesn't exist and isn't valid. It doesn't. And now, after 40 years of oil extraction and activity, we have brothers who have, in the middle of a pandemic, don't have access to water. And so what I want to tell you all is those who invest money in those corporations, they are profiting off of the blood of indigenous people, and that is shameful. And that kind of profit, so I consider them also to be assassins. And for them to get rich of that, that is not development. We want a real kind of development for our communities and a real dialogue, and with economic justice and land justice, and for the indigenous communities that respects the human rights, so that we can keep building our real shared house. And our shared house is being contaminated, and even so, we keep struggling and keep resisting, and we're going to keep doing that and the new generation that's going to come is also going to do that, and is also going to keep fighting. And this reactivation or extraction, economic extraction, comes with tricks and lies. And that kind of development is a lie, and what the government says. But if that was the case, we wouldn't be in the streets as indigenous communities organizing ourselves, showing that in the Amazon, there's no kind of development that is real. What they have left us is death and destruction. That is what they have left us with their development plan or model. Thank you.
Well, Lizardo, you couldn't be more clear or inspiring. Thank you so much. And you know, for all of us who are here in Canada, I think it's important in unceded Indigenous territories. I think it's important for you to know that the company that is being where the Indigenous leaders were murdered, PetroTal, is a Canadian company. So there is certainly more organizing for us to do. I want to turn soon to Canna House, because there's a lot of questions piling up about Trans Mountain and what's happening here in Canada. But Andreas, I just wanted to check with you if you had anything to add. I will come back to you. But Canada's, so a whole bunch of questions here about Trans Mountain, and actually, there's questions about whether or not, if the project isn't viable, like, so for those of you who are joining us from the Amazon, we have this very big new pipeline proposed here in Canada, where that is was proposed 8 years ago, and they still say it's economically critical to have this new pipeline, which would expand the tar sands. But oil demand has slowed, and the price of oil has dropped, and so there's some questions around, well, if it's no longer viable, and it's not, you know, I know only about 7% of it is built, why does Trudeau keep pushing it, is one of the questions we have. And another question we have, Canada House, is this question around, but don't some Indigenous nations or Indigenous peoples support TMX? And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you think is going on in the politics of TMX.
Hello, yes, I could answer that. This is one of the most important questions that people continue to ask us as we resist against this tar sands pipeline, is that Canada and the government of Canada and these corporations have been seeking to get the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous nations. And one of the things that Canada does, and it's very well known for doing this, is going to the wrong bodies for this proper consent. It is the grassroots people, it's the Indigenous people collectively, a part of our nation, that hold our Indigenous title and rights, the actual land rights to our land. We call it title here, Indigenous title and rights. And those are our sovereign rights, our inherent rights to our lands. And it's the people, again, like I said, collectively that hold these rights. And when the colonial government established itself on our land, it unilaterally imposed the Indian Act. And under this Indian Act are these government imposed leaders, as they call them, like a chief and council system. It's all under the Indian Act, and it's funded by the federal government. And people that look at Canada and our resistance has to be very clear when they are supporting or standing in solidarity with Indigenous people, that it is the grassroots Indigenous people that are on the ground actively fighting for our collective rights. Again, there is leadership here, so-called leadership here in unceded BC that I guess claims their leadership, but again, it's funded by the federal government and it's opposed by the federal government, and that has to be a very clear distinction. And it's the proper title and rights holders, again, are the collective people on the ground. For us here in Secwepemc territory, it's 10,000 Secwepemc people in our nation, and each and every one of them have a right to say whether we want this pipeline or not. And if one child, one youth stands up, one elder stands up and says no, then we must respect that. It's a part of our law of consensus here in our nation. So it's something that is a part of our traditional governance, and we have instated. We hosted a Secwepemc Uluk assembly called on by my late father, Arthur Manuel, where we brought our nation together and passed our Secwepemc Uluk Declaration against the Kinder Morgan, now Trans Mountain pipeline. And that was our traditional form of decision making in our nation. So we still have that in our nation, a very distinct governance structure. And we need to respect that, and people need to be able to define and know the difference between the ones funded by the federal government and the real grassroots peoples. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think it's probably one of the most depressing things that I experience in doing work on TMX and also on larger tar sands issues, is that the question I get almost most frequently is this question about how, don't some Indigenous nations support it? Or with Trans Mountain, I've been so horrified to hear our own government repeatedly saying, well, this number of nations have signed agreements. This number of nations have signed agreements. So I can't remember how many they say now, 40 or 50, I don't know, the number changes the more people that they and communities that they strong arm.
Yeah, could I just respond again to that?
Please,
This pipeline is 1,152 kilometers long, coming from the Edmonton terminal to the Westridge Marine Terminal. They want to increase the tanker size, increase it by 7-fold. Vancouver and the West Coast have never seen a super tanker of this magnitude. If you lay those super tankers to up and down, it's higher than the highest high rise in Vancouver. So people could just imagine the size of these tankers that they want to bring along the coast all the way to the refineries in California, like you mentioned. I want to say that the Secwepemc Nation is over half of this whole pipeline. And when the federal government uses terms like First Nations, they're referring to an Indian Act band, which is not the full traditional territory of a real sovereign nation. And that needs to be very clear, is that when they're saying that they have the support of the First Nations, it's not a sovereign Indigenous nation they're talking about. It's talking about the federal Indian bands that they're talking to and referring to. The Secwepemc Uluk, our territory, makes up over half of this pipeline. It's over half, 518 kilometers, that threatens our territory. So we're almost half of the length of this pipeline, and we're one nation. And we've unanimously, as the peoples, passed this declaration against it. So we have to be very clear in their terminology of us as Indigenous people. When they say First Nations, it's not referring to a sovereign Indigenous nation. It's a federal Indian band. Thanks.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I thought it was really telling when Sandy Garasino from the National Observer interviewed Trudeau. Was it a couple of years ago? I'm sure you both will remember it, when a reporter interviewed our Prime Minister and asked him about the decision to approve the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And he talked about how he had made a deal with the Premier of Alberta in order to ensure that there was support for other parts of his climate plan, the carbon pricing, et cetera. And that deal that he struck was prior to the completion of the consultation with Indigenous nations. And he said it right there out loud. That and it was, it was amazing to me that then it can just go on as though there is, true engagement and agreement and consultation with Indigenous nations. And I want to say one thing, having worked on this for a really long time, is that this numbers game that my government is playing about how many First Nations, how many band councils support or don't support a project, is reprehensible, because you don't give human rights to some people and not to other people. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about human rights. And so that means that every Indigenous nation should have the opportunity for true consent and consultation, and not just some nations. It's not about who are the majority. I think that's just so reprehensible. Melina, I know, your camera's off. Are you still with us? We're almost at the end of our time, but I know these are issues that you have dealt with for a very long time, and this question of, well, isn't there division, as though every community is supposed to be unanimous all the time? It's that in itself is kind of objectification and racism. But I'm wondering, if there's, I know, more than most, you've thought and studied and written on these questions, and I'm just wondering if there's anything you want to add to this conversation.
Sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me okay? Just put a headset on. I think what Candice was saying was bang on. I think that the issue with Canadian society is that they don't really understand the differentiations and the way that the federally imposed Indian Act system has had such a detrimental impact on the governance structures and systems and the ways in which communities are allowed to consent or not consent. So I think it's important for people that are non-Indigenous to understand that the chief and council systems are an imposed system that was made by the federal government that is not reflective of governance and decision-making processes that have existed in indigenous communities for millennia. And so I think it's when the federal government brings up, or the media or whoever wants to bring up and show divisions within our communities, it's just a way to undermine indigenous sovereignty. Because if indigenous communities had the right to say no, had the ability to say no, could say no, and then the projects wouldn't happen, I think it would be a different situation. So anytime they get maybe potentially one person to sign on that a lot of times hasn't consulted with their own community, it just shows that the government is responsible continuously for like genocide, but also for undermining indigenous sovereignty, as they have from day one with the colonization of Canada, and not allowing indigenous communities the free, prior, and informed consent and ability to say no, which is a part of quote unquote consultation, but that has never existed. What we've seen in the Alberta tar sands is nation after nation has tried to fight, say no, legally oppose, and blockade, and all of the things that we've been talking about here, that I've been seeing my whole life growing up in Alberta tar sands. Communities have attempted to repeatedly say no to all of these projects, and yet single one is stamped and approved. And that shows how much they do not care or respect indigenous sovereignty in so-called Canada and across the world.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat. I'm going to ask our interpreters, or maybe Alicia. I know you're still there. Alicia, who works for Stand, is in Ecuador, and I know she speaks Spanish. There's a question from Jen Castro to Lizardo about red, but I'm afraid I can't read it. So if one of the translators wants to pop in and read that, either in Spanish to Lizardo or in English to the rest of us, that would be great. And while you're looking at that to find it, I'm going to ask Andres, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you, Andres, the one more question. There's been a lot of questions in the chat around this moment in time that we're in. It's difficult to organize during COVID. We haven't been able to have as many rallies and marches, and so if you have advice about what people should be doing right now to organize, to raise awareness on these issues. Andreas, can you hear me?
Sí, creo que uno de los temas principales es
I think one thing, an important topic is to generate consciousness. So we just watched the movie Condor and Eagle. How can we be, because we can be really uninformed about what's happening across the continent, but once we know about them, and once we realize or learn about those realities, that allows us to join the condor and the eagle, to join struggles, right? And to defend and join in a path to unity. And I think that's really important. These conversations are really important to be able to include youth and other people that can know about these realities, and so they can be more visibilized, what's happening in the north, what's happening here in Amazonia and all of the territories. This will generate more consciousness, and that's the beginning of action. And also in terms of communication, and these visual medias and these panels where lots of people are watching and are being educated and are having their consciousness raised. And that is something very important, so that we can weave our struggles together and look for solutions together. Because while we're not united and while our struggles are isolated and aren't known on other parts of the planet, it's going to be harder. The more we can connect our struggles, and they can be connected through these mechanisms and these tools and technologies. We're going to be able to reach always a broader public and audience. And so always generating consciousness is a really fundamental step that we have to achieve. And then also for like advocacy and campaigns of visualization, and also so that the communities can get their message out and to have our own vision and narratives put out there, and that'll also make our message be heard, not just by the government, because I think the governments never will listen to us, but if the societies of our countries can listen, we'll have better results.
Thank you very much. We're going to have one last quick question, and then I'm going to close us out for the evening. Luzardo, are you there? There is a question for you specifically about what you think of the program RED and whether it's helping strengthen the territory's defense, or is it an empty effort that is not protecting your territory? Do you want to answer that?
Sí, nosotros siempre hemos tenido una visión muy crítica de cualquier...
Yes, we have also had a critical analysis of whatever policy that isn't attached to the realities and the needs of the communities. And so here we take it with like tweezers or tongs. We don't touch them directly, and they come from the states and they're assimilated into the communities without an understanding, a basic understanding of the communities. So like in the movie, when there's an understanding or a consultation with the communities, it's different. But when a project comes or a proposal or program comes without that basic understanding of the communities, you always have to be really cautious about those kinds of initiatives and proposals. And also the communities are in their right and their autonomy to freely associate with those, especially or to decide what is best for them. And that's why we always look to communities to decide what is best for them. And if the communities determine that it does not benefit them, then, you know, to be cautious with those programs.
Of course, of course. And for those who are interested, the Indigenous Environment Network, IEN, does a lot of work on this topic, trying to bring together views of many Indigenous nations around the world. You can find out more information on IEN. There's been a lot of great information and links in the chat to how you can take action. We are stronger when we're together, when we can be greater than the sum of our parts. And that requires all of us not just to watch movies, though it's very exciting to have this film as a tool in our activism and organizing, but then to also take action, to join together, to join and support all of these incredible initiatives directly. tinyhousewarriors.com, Sacred Earth Solar, Indigenous Climate Action, the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative. Join together and support these initiatives. Donate if you can, if you have the ability. I want to, I think for, on behalf of probably many listening, and certainly all of us at Stand.Earth tonight, thank you, all four of you, for your incredible work, for taking the time, when I know how hard all of you are working, to spend with us, to talk about these issues. Our hearts and prayers to everyone to stay safe in this very difficult time. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think Lizardo, you may be our elder on the panel. Lizardo, are you there? Can you turn your camera on one last time? His link from the Amazon might not, there he is. I'm wondering if you would like to make the session complete and final, if you have some last words or a prayer for us as we all go out into our individual journeys.
Muchas gracias. A pesar
Thank
de
you.
todas las amenazas, a pesar de todo lo que se vive,
Even with all of the threats
pero también estamos
and everything we're living in each one of our countries, we're proposing alternatives, and in this case, initiatives like territories for life, recognizing that we have sacred spaces and places that we respect. In this case, the spiritual connection that we have. And for us, our fresh water is important. And we have binational agendas in Ecuador and like in sacred headwaters, and to establish mechanisms with Brazil to defend territories where there's also isolated communities that need protection, with Bolivia, with Colombia. And this will permit us as indigenous communities to see that there aren't borders or barriers in terms of respecting rights. And also to ask for solidarity from the international community in the world to say we are here as we are indigenous communities in the middle of a pandemic, but we are alive to respond. That Amazonia as the heart of the world, we're going to keep protecting, and from humanity, as Asians, as Americans, Europeans, they have to be in solidarity. And you can't just see us as obstacles to development. On the contrary, we want that our voice and that our territory and that our land be given a hug like human beings that live on this planet Earth. Good evening and thank you. Good night. And we're going to keep fighting for our lives and for humanity. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you so much, Lizardo, Melina, Cannahouse, Andreas. Thank you for all of your incredible work and for joining us. To the filmmakers at Condor and Eagle for all of your incredible work to spread these stories and more. Stay safe, everyone.